We will look at a few things here before we conclude the chapter from the book in the next podcast, and then I'll take a lot of material on behavior, brain, modern human being, and evolution of thought, evolution of intelligence, and so on from other sources. But a few points to be made before we summarize this chapter from the book is to look at the evolution of so-called multifunctional brain, which is similar to intelligence, and the argument is whether it was a brain that was already there and then environmental, sociological, and social stratification, complexification kind of non-genetic factors brought all the existent properties of the brain together and created emergent human properties. So the Stewart and Cohen argument that we already looked at in the context of other emergent properties here says multifunctional characteristics that appear suddenly. One of the universal features of complicity is the emergence of new patterns, new rules, new structures, new processes that were not present even in a rudimentary form in the separate components. So complicity here is not in the sense of being complicit in a crime or hiding something, but it is complicity of multiple evolutionary features that were around and that would come together to create this sudden emergent property such as a multifunctional characteristic of human brain, and we will look at more at the multifunctional characteristics later. So the argument here is that the emergence of new patterns, new rules, new structures, new processes that were not present even in rudimentary forms in the separate components, that happened. For language and intelligence, this is abundantly the case. Here, the most influential new possibility opened up by complicity is that language permits experiences to be stored in the memories of older people and passed on to the young. The collective experiences of the tribe become a cultural lexicon stored in people that surround each child. So that is something that is a co-benefit or an emergent property coming out of language, and obviously passed on oral knowledge and storage in memory becomes part of the brain's evolution as well. And there is the idea also that hunting and gathering and providing for the family created much more time for the children to play and grow up and be with each other, and that may have conferred additional benefits that added to this so-called revolutionary innovation to emerge suddenly in the human evolution. An aspect of human adaptability that could also be taken as a key emergent innovation is identified by Chris Sinha in his 1987 work. Thus, the revolution of infancy was the biological mechanism through which the potential for intergenerational culture transmission created by tool use was optimized, and appropriation was the specific social and ontogenetic processes in response to which the niche of infancy evolved. So ontogenetic is basically the physical growth stages, birth, childhood, infancy, adolescence, adulthood, and so on, and that is related to social processes as well in this narrative. In this respect, the evolution of infancy was not so much a terminal point of biological evolution, but the crucial inaugural moment in socialization of biology. So you have genetic evolutionary factors, biology, and then socialization begins to affect evolution. Such an evolutionary process, I suggest, would lead to a rapidly expanding endogenous spiral of change and adaptation. Adaptation again here in a genetic sense. So there are at least four possible causal explanations of human revolutionary innovation in this sense, as summarized by the book. The African Enlightenment of circa 70,000 years ago and the European Enlightenment of circa 50,000 years ago were caused by complexification of the human brain, neuronal connections and so on, not new evolution. Well, I guess complexification is an evolution, but the factor is not necessarily a mutation or a genetic evolution in that sense. This is a popular explanation, but it creates more problems than it solves. The first brain change should have provided evidence in the form of new artifacts that should have spread and whose manufacture should have been continuously maintained. New artifacts that there were, but their use petered out, and further improvements which might have been expected if there had been a permanent brain change did not occur. A second brain change triggered the European Enlightenment, bringing more complex language and increased cognition, resulting in experiments with new artifacts. This is tempting, but evidence is lacking, and the hypothesis implies that there were two independent brain changes. That has to be explained as well, especially in terms of differences in climate, social structures, behavioral structures, maybe exposure to Neanderthals in one case and not in the other, and so on and so forth. The second explanation is the McBrearty and Brooks model of accretion of different behaviors and artifacts because of stressful conditions that promoted group interactions. So if there are resource limitations and sharing and cooperation is needed, then stressful conditions create group interactions. Their interpretation does not require the anatomical and functional evolution of the brain. It is just existing brain interacting differently with different groups of different social behavior, let's say, or language. We hasten to repeat that any change in behavior that produces innovative artifacts or novel interpretations of phenomena are likely to be revolutionary in their impact. Furthermore, such changes do not require the assistance of natural selection. Imitation and learning are all that are required for useful novelties to spread. So without a new brain evolution, the evolutionary impact can occur by watching and learning, imitation. Thirdly, our working hypothesis has been that sapiens' brain had adequate potential to produce creativity under certain circumstances. So it already existed. Those circumstances included a period of stress that disequilibrated normal behavior and released repressed behavioral adaptabilities that allowed the affected humans to accommodate to the stress. This was followed by a time of improving resources when new behaviors continued to be applied prior to settlement into stasis once again. So what do you learn? How much of it you carry, even though it evolved in a stressful situation, even when the stressor is removed, that behavior continues. However, the evidence from studies of isolated present-day human groups suggests that our working hypothesis is inadequate, that unchanging stability is the rule, that natural disasters are accommodated without permanent behavioral change, and that only invasion by technologically modern humans was sufficient for disequilibration and, in many cases, demise of the existing behaviors, for example. Okay, this is obviously having a debate about this revolutionary innovation. Was it related to stresses, where the stresses of invasion from another group, or was environmental requiring cooperation, or was it just existing latent ability in the brain that got expressed under different sociological environmental conditions? The last sentence of the third explanation suggests that its synthesis with the McBrearty and Brooks model, which would emphasize behavioral hybrid vigor, implicit in the latter. Hybrid vigor is the genetics term for new phenotypic characteristics that emerge when two previously isolated strains are allowed to interbreed. So phenotypic, of course, means environment makes that genetic ability to appear because of environmental stress or some other environmental trigger, and this requires that pre-existing phenotypic characteristics, previously isolated strains are interbred, and then hybrid vigor in genetic forms emerges. Okay, such a behavioral vigor marked by flashes of creativity might have arisen when two or more previously isolated stable groups congregated in the same area due to climate change. So we bring climate finally. For example, a cooling and drying period might have desertified former hunting and gathering grounds. In the case of the European Enlightenment of circa 50,000 years ago, several groups of Homo sapiens may have congregated due to glaciation of formerly benign environments. Closer contact with the Neanderthals may have been a significant part of the mix, even though it was finally deadly for the Neanderthals. Again, we don't know whether Neanderthals really had conflicts with sapiens and disappeared, or whether they just simply got outnumbered and interbred and left their genetics into a merged sapien-sapien species. Here again, as early conjectures, human natures have strongly been shaped by multi-level human societies. So this brings in social stratification into the mix about behavioral and revolutionary innovation evolution. So multi-level human societies include families, bands, tribes, trade networks, and so on, and by population pressures all interacting in a positive feedback system. So there may be a system which is rich enough that it allows artists to just do art and give them food and I don't know, whatever income to survive without being part of the hunting-gathering society, hunting-gathering part of the society. So social stratification could have played a role as well in the evolution of behavioral traits. Morton, on the other hand, puts it this way in his view of Pinker's revolutionary psychology book, How the Mind Works. This is about the evolutionary psychologists offering sociological, anthropological explanations for the revolutionary innovation and multifunctional brain. The human's mind is the way it is because big complicated minds have in the past helped human beings get their genes into the next generation. From this it follows that the mind is not the all-purpose thinking machine philosophers and psychologists have often taken it for. The mind has been developed to think in specific useful ways, and its structure reflects this. So this is a very different idea, saying that there is some selection beyond natural selection happening, where human mind is not as powerful and all-thinking as assumed. In the previous discussion we were going through with Stewart and Cohen and Ehrlich and so on, but that somehow there is this complicated big minds pushing their own genes into future generations. The implication of evolutionary psychology is that intelligence and related mental qualities are aggregates of gene-determined behaviors that appeared one at a time and were naturally selected and accumulated before and during the Pleistocene. So slightly different, maybe very different explanation. The aggregates, they argue, create the illusion of all-purpose thinking abilities. But this authors of this book disagree with that, and they say that in fact there was a sudden evolution of intelligence, multifunctional brain, revolutionary innovation, and not this accumulation during the Pleistocene. So slightly different views, but the basic question in the context of this course is, what role did climate play? And as you can see, there is this running theme that maybe environmental stressors and climate change were involved in the complexification of societies, stratification of societies, impacting the brain, maybe creating new connections or better expression of existing latent abilities in terms of behavior. Okay, so we will come back and add a few more points and conclude this book, but then we'll take material from several other sources to make additional points about evolution of behavior, always keeping in mind whether climate actually played a role in the evolution of brain and behavior, without distinguishing behavior, intelligence, evolved thinking, and so on. Okay.